And we're back.
Woo.
Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Season 4 of the Probability Podcast. We're back after a bit of an extended hiatus. Took a little bit of time off to enjoy the summer and that type of thing, but we're back and ready to rock and roll, right, Patrick?
Absolutely.
So
Point us in the right direction.
So this week we thought we'd explore the topic of digital identity.
What?
As
What is
just sort of
that?
like, who are we in the digital space, I suppose, is really what that boils down to. But as we look at IDs moving into apps and wallets and governments and tech firms, they're really looking at a widening and expanding of our identity into the digital space, right? And I mean, the stakes are high, essentially, if you think about it, right? Your face, your voice can be used to unlock services and, equally expose you to, hacked accounts and AI deepfakes that steal your likeness. I mean, we're really entering like uncharted territory, right? And then what happens to that likeness, right? Does it, how is it used across social media and other platforms? And, how are you going to safeguard that against deepfakes? Once people have the tools to recreate your identity and recreate your likeness, I mean, what does that mean exactly? And how can others use that to, expose you in ways that you don't want to be exposed? Even if you look at, generally speaking, an AI and how it's able to learn so much about you, right? Can companies use it to create a digital twin of you over time? You look at, how these video platforms like OpenAI Sora is allowing you to, upload your digital identity and even share it. And what are the implications for that, right? And are you losing control? And even, looking at celebrities and how, their identities are being cloned, or how we're having, AI representations of, celebrities that are out there, and what does it mean for their identity and their legacy? So I thought we'd just take a look and really unpack what's happening and where the threats are and what steps we all need to take to protect what makes us uniquely digitally ourselves, Patrick. So are you ready to face the mental projection of your digital self?
You mean like the cynical AI version?
Yeah, I was thinking of the Matrix. They said it's what we call the residual self-image, I guess,
Yeah.
right? And it's if you think about it, at some point, even when you're not here, there's going to be some residual of that image that or that identity that lives on kind of forever, right? In
Yeah.
essence.
Well, you brought up a lot of really interesting points about, you're as a person, right? You have an identity you need to manage on the internet and on services, right? And right now they're all scattered all over by each service, right? And recently, I mean, we've seen now you can log in using like like a Google authentication and that kind of thing. And that's been shared, that login method has been shared throughout many different services now. So we're branching into the concept of being able to support an ID, right? A centralized ID. But the real question is, who's gonna manage that centralized ID, right? I don't want Google to manage it, right? I don't know about you, but I like to have my own privacy and my own control, right? And so that goes into, who are the holders, who has the keys, right, to all this information, and how accessible is it? Right. Well, if we're looking at the centralization, the European Union they're setting up this EIDAS legal framework, and it's basically a European Digital Identity Initiative. And they've introduced this concept of electronic ID, and the ability to have this interoperable across many public and private services. So they're
Hmm.
actually moving into this, right? Now, what comes to mind is, the number of the beast, right? You ever heard that,
Well,
right?
who's in control ultimately, right? If like back to your point around like, who's ultimately managing that ID, but really who's in control of it. And,
Yeah.
if someone has some ultimate control over, this sort of idea of digital identity, and that digital identity is used to access so much of your world, then how quickly could they take it away, or how quickly could they misuse it, or how quickly could they
Oh,
disappear you,
it's
right?
it's incredibly dangerous, right? It's one thing right now if somebody steals your Facebook account, right? It's
Yeah.
another thing if they manage to access and steal your identity that's used everywhere, right? And that's where we're going, right? So what I'm talking about with the number of the beast, there's lots of conversations around, uh, a bio identification capability that's implanted, right? That's a digital bridge, identification bridge that you can then use, and you would scan against it, and that would be your identity, and then you'd have an online identity with all the other information it would be tied to. So it's a bridge from your physical to your virtual, and
Hmm.
everybody runs around with this number of the beast, so to speak, on their hands or on their forehead, wherever, right? And this is, there's lots of profitized, stories around this, but we're getting closer and closer to that, right? Because if you think about what is ID, ID is, tied to credentials and authentication and all that. And it's so in order to authenticate, there's a combination of things where you know, it's something you have, something something that you basically can calculate or reference. Um, the the concept of identity is getting more and more complex,
We
right?
especially seeing as that like so much of what we interact with is digital now, right? Where it wasn't the case, and it's one of the things we love to do in this podcast is kind of go, back in my day, kind of thing. But when you think about it, even though we had some element of digital, in our lives, many years ago, um, there was still a fair bit of analog involved there. So even if I think about how I accessed my banking, for example, right? Sure, I was going into a store and putting that card into a machine, or I was going into a bank machine to withdraw money. But I mean, it was really, what was it? It was a magnetic strip on a card that was interfacing, and then I had to punch in my number, right? But that number was in my head, for example, right? And there's still some element of that, but now we've bridged into like biometrics. And I mean, every week I go to the grocery store and I pay with Apple Pay, and I pick up my phone, I put it in front of my face, and it scans my face and recognizes me and pays for it. So who's to say that if things get sophisticated enough that that wouldn't be more easily hackable than someone trying to hack into my biological brain and figure out what that code is, for example, right? So it brings
Yeah,
it into a whole new realm of things because of how integrated everything we do is. I don't even carry real money anymore,
yeah.
right?
I think the idea of biological bridging really it would tie into your unique DNA as well. So your your
Yeah, yeah.
device, right? Your bio device, your bio ID device would actually only be active by your own DNA, right?
Hmm.
Um, if it's misplaced or whatever and moved to another person, it would no longer be active, right? That kind of thing. Something so difficult, right, to cheat, right, to bypass, to get around. That it's essentially makes your what you have with you, or in you, in this case, um, very, very unique, right? And one of a kind, right? So that's where you're going ultimately, is trying to build that uh, ID that is very under your management, under your control, and then it's bridged with the idea of a more, you know, we'll say complete, or you know, extra, extra information and extra data tied to a virtual ID, right? So the question is, if you have this ID capability tied somehow to your physical being, there's still going to be a central repository out there, or many central repositories out there, that's going to be linked to that ID, right?
Yeah, it
And
contains
have
that
more
DNA.
information, and
Yeah.
they're hackable by nature, right?
Yeah, I guess that's the real risk, right? Of all of this stuff we're using now that's biometric, whether I'm scanning my face or using my fingerprint to unlock a laptop, that information is now stored somewhere. And then if someone gets that, how can they utilize that, right? And then, like you said, even if we tied it to our DNA itself, then how do you protect that, and how do you stop people from accessing that and using that in other ways? And it's it really means at the end of the day, like, there is no perfect system, and maybe it's a combination of things, right? When you think about, like, how do you prove in a world of digital identity where we're going to quickly steamroll towards this idea of being able to steal identities and copy identities. You think about AI and
Yeah,
quantum computing and whatnot, right? But then you think about the technologies that are used to protect, sort of originality. So if I think about, like, blockchain, for example,
yeah,
right? And NFTs, and how they were using sort of blockchain to prove that this was the original. So if I'm buying, like, a digital copy of a piece of art, how do I prove that I own the original when really you can copy something that's digitally? Well, they were using this idea of blockchain, right?
yeah.
And so I wonder if there's some sort of element of that as well. But it is an important thing that people don't really think about every day, that identity theft has been going on forever, right? But it used
It
to
has.
take a lot more effort to actually steal your identity, right? It was a lot of phishing type attacks and
It's
what have
easier
you,
now
right?
than ever, I think.
Yeah, because everything's digital, so then
Yeah,
it's more easily hackable, and then, being able to make copies of it and then use that digital identity to access your banking, to access almost anything, because that's the way we exist, right? We don't
yeah,
have physical currency, we don't have physical keys, where, like, everything's digital and we exist digitally. And I mean, so much of what I access every day doesn't require any sort of in-person interaction or any multiple chains of authentication, unless I enable them myself, which oftentimes I do. So it's, I mean, this could get to be a very involved topic, but I think just kind of framing out, like, what digital identity is and what it means from, like, a fundamental point of view in terms of how it impacts our everyday is, I think, an important kind of
yeah. I
basement
mean,
into this discussion.
talk about our talk about our our identification as we utilize our accounts on our finances, right? Whether it be pension, RSP, or bank accounts, or investment accounts. That's your Those are very important IDs to you, right?
Hmm.
And ultimately, we're looking at those establishments to protect those IDs, protect that information of authentication, right? Um, and with that, um, there's been many cases of, you know, bad actors being able to infiltrate and steal information, right? So this happens all the time. So there's no perfect system right now, and which we have to really spend a lot of time uh, to consider how we could make this better, because it's a mess. It's just a big mess right now. And through this big mess of all this decentralized, millions of points of authentication, we're protected, right? Because of you can only get at one piece at a time, right? And
Hmm.
whereas, if you're a bad actor, you collect those pieces. I mean, take for instance your phone, right? They don't really need to clone your phone. They just need to clone the SIM on your phone, right? And then they can figure out, the information back and forth, what apps they can use, intermediate apps to grab the information that's going back and forth to your phone, and now to this new quasi phone, which is then can be that information can be rerouted, right? So this whole thing about devices being unique to you, um, the big question is how. How does that prove you're unique,
Mm.
right? So that to me is a huge issue. And I think that's why eventually we're going to come to this bio bridge uh, identification marker, right? That makes it so unique that there will be no other capability of number one, uh, getting it wrong, right? The wrong
Hmm.
person. Number two, having that access, right? You have access to you, and you're carrying that around with you, right?
Yeah, well, like back to what we talked about before, though, like who should be in control? And I think it's an interesting debate because
Yeah,
if you think about, okay, obviously in terms of being a citizen of a country, in terms of your government, you definitely need to. There needs to be some basis of an identification within a government entity, right? When you're filing taxes, you're applying for benefits, right? There has to be some means to identify like who you are and whether you're, legitimately a citizen and all the other data points that are associated with you as a person, right? I mean, the government keeps a digital profile on you, for example, but should
and
governments
they
be the
are
ones
over
that
many different systems, even in the government.
well, yeah, I learned that. I've done a bit of work in government and found out that just getting some details updated in one system doesn't mean it's updated in the other. And I went through that from like a tax and benefit type thing as well. It was kind of interesting how siloed some of that is. But I mean, you definitely need that there. For example, within the government, that's more of like a legal type thing and accessing kind of your basic level of services and being able to pay your taxes. But I think is there an argument to say that well, maybe governments need to be able to use a digital ID, but should it be kind of like more like an independent third party that's sort of in charge of defining the digital IDs and protecting them, and that essentially it's a service to you as a person, and then you have more control over it. Because I think that when I have some sort of digital ID with the government, but I don't have any control over it, other than the fact that I do have avenues to go in and update it in ways and access it, but I ultimately don't have any like control over it in a sense. Is that do I have a legal control over it? And I think that's part of what they're aiming for with this digital ID, endeavor amongst a bunch of different countries and governments. But I guess I'm asking you, like, where do you think that should sit?
Yeah, well, to me, I don't want to be sit in the government's lap either, right? Um, if you pay a service, then you're going to pay the rest of your life for this, right? Right now, it's you basically authenticate against every service that you use, and then those service providers are then in charge of making sure that that their accounts aren't being hacked, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the onus is on them, right? Imagine taking that away and saying, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? So right now, let's say you use, you access many accounts, and you always say, well, use my Google, account, and then your Google account gets hacked, right?
Yeah.
That means that now they have access, these bad actors now have access to almost everything because you centralized it, right?
Yeah,
So
it's true. Yeah.
decentralization right now is our friend, not our enemy. So if you go to a centralized option of a digital ID, um, that I would say it has to be an independent third party.
Hmm.
However, I don't want to pay that service for that service.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's
They
the
have to
thing. Yeah.
find methods of making an income, and I don't want them selling my data. in order to make,
Well,
and
that's
that's
what's
what
going
the
to
Google
happen
model is, right?
either way, right? On the
Yeah,
private side, it's there's going to be potentially some element of that,
yeah,
maybe. But the only way really for it to work is for there not to be. But then you're going to pay a premium, right? So when I mean, that's the basis of all these social networks. That essentially you get it for free. Although there's some element of monetization there if you want to promote things and so on. But ultimately, you are the product, and by signing up, you're agreeing that they can utilize your data to do more marketing on the platform, or to, in some cases to sell it to other firms. Or I mean, there's been a lot of challenges there, but at the same time, it's like somebody's got to have some control over it. And like any other service, you might feel like if the right company was involved and the right legal, precedents were in place for it, then you might feel a little bit safer. Like I think the idea is that you would just have more ownership over it ultimately, and that when you think about, I mean, we definitely need ways to interact with government. We need ways to be identified to travel to other countries, but at the same time, we also need to think in terms of, um, what other uses are there for this data, and is it better that, like anything we look at, you look at like if you look at a government entity and the way they operate versus a private company, oftentimes the private company is motivated by profit, but they're also motivated by longevity, by loyalty of users. They're trying to build up like a user base, right? And so that if you're in charge of digital identity, then your reputation as a company is everything. And I don't know, there hasn't really been a real, strong player emerge in that system, but
no,
I think you're going to see it, right? Because I think people are becoming a little bit more wary of maybe their digital identity solely existing within government, but it's interesting.
well, the idea of centralization of your digital ID, is it going to happen or not, right? I think there's a lot of pressure to centralize an ID, right, and then utilize that ID, right, from different service providers, right. The the idea though of maintaining that and supporting a system with that that's tied specifically to you, again, to me, this is going back to a bio bridge combination identification, right? Um, and that picture a kind of like a similar to an RFID chip in your hand,
Hmm.
right, in your palm, and basically you put it up and you get scanned, and that information now is your ID, right? That gets tied to whatever those transactions are going to be
Yeah,
performed,
yeah.
right? Now, the idea there is, okay, what happens if, someone cuts your hand off and then uses your hand? Well, that won't be good, right? So there has to be fail safes, so specific types of solutions put together in order to make that technology actually work properly without endangering you physically, right? With,
Yeah,
like again, a bad actor goes and lops your hand off and then uses the hand like a fingerprint, right?
yeah.
Um,
And you're a thing
again,
from the Adams family.
yeah, yeah. I don't want that. I don't. I'm sure a lot of people don't want that. So
I think you touched on something there though. Like
yeah,
if the point you touched on there of like decentralization is interesting because like I kind of mentioned earlier, blockchain is like fundamentally a decentralized model, right? And that it's sort of a distribution of identity and security, right? That you have, for example, either more of like a public blockchain, which is sort of like Bitcoin, that anybody can join and participate in this larger network of things, or you have like more of a private or permissioned blockchain, and like how would that work in terms of identity? So the idea is that it's not centralized. There's no centralized place to attack it in essence, right? And then the way you access it is in a sort of a decentralized manner, I guess, essentially. So I think,
but you still need that private key, right? And that's your
yeah,
again, that's your fail-safe point. That's where everything has to be managed around. And regardless, I mean, we've heard so many stories about people losing their account, crypto account, right, number, and then they've lost millions, and it's no longer accessible. You lose the number, you're screwed. right? Um,
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, no
yeah,
system's perfect, right? So obviously in the age of AI, you know, being a threat essentially, right? So in the hands of bad actors, as you like to say, whether it's AI or quantum chips, I mean, we're definitely facing a threat. But then, like we've talked about previously, this is where it can also be used as a defense, right? So
yeah,
something like AI could be used to really more intelligently determine if you are the actual person. So instead of being like a single point of failure or a single point of corruption, like your fingerprint or what have you, it's looking at many different things and kind of looking at location, looking at behaviors and patterns and all kinds of things to sort of figure out, are you who you say you are? For example, right? Like
yeah.
I'll give you a kind of a funny example is that we were trying to get some concert tickets today actually, and I was ill disposed. I was at wrapped up in work and whatnot, and my wife had some free time, so I gave her my login and kind
Oh,
of thought everything will be fine, right? Which largely it was, right? I gave her my Ticketmaster login and so on, and but what happened was, from my memory at least, sometimes I would get prompted for like an authentication code at the time I try to get in and access things. And in this case, it actually forced her to put in a code when she tried to pay for the transaction because she was accessing a credit card. Now, I've never had that happen, but obviously it looked at patterns and looked at IP addresses and the browser and who knows what else that Ticketmaster is looking at to understand, is this the actual person that owns the account? And somewhere they decided that it wasn't, I think, because I've never been asked for like a two-factor authentication at that stage in the transaction, but something was built in there. So I thought that was kind of interesting that
yeah,
it's that clearly they were looking at more than the fact that she just had my login to be able to go in and pay for tickets with that credit card. So maybe that's
yeah.
like a simplistic example, but I think
No,
that
it's not. No, it's
yeah,
not. I mean, basically, the financial institutions are dealing with that problem now.
yeah,
With
yeah.
with their credit cards and their debit cards or whatever they are for the access to the account. So that that's a problem today, and that they like we talked about a little bit of card not present transactions, right? So how is that? How is card not present being managed in an extended way? So, um, for instance, extra questions get asked of you, right? Or uh, like you said, some kind of two-factor authentication is now, or multi-factor authentication is now activated because, right, the all these certain points, certain data points are not lining up. So then it goes to the next level of authentication, right? And that's what we talk about with AI is its ability to look at all these different data points and then move to the next level. And you know, this is where we get into a point of, well, we cannot do this virtually today. You need to go into this establishment and verify yourself, right? Ultimately, right? Um, that's
Uh,
where it could go, for
are you saying
instance,
we're
to
just going to
resolve.
go back to the old days where we had to walk into a bank to identify
Yeah,
ourselves?
and then provide your information and blah blah blah, right? So when we think about it, there's a lot of documents out there that kind of hide or sorry, control our they're primary vectors for our access to other things, whether it be a passport or a license or your health card, that kind of thing, right? There's a bunch of centralized documents, and those documents are specific numbers, and those numbers are tied to your ID. So we have that today, as in the government systems, and I see the government ultimately implementing a centralized ID. I see them implementing that. The question is, because they have need for it, the question is, how will that be managed and hosted, right? And
Hmm.
do we trust the government to manage and host, right? Is that something that is wise as a as a democratic society? Should that be where it resides? I don't know. I don't have the answer for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, how is that being utilized in a non-government sense, right? Is that
Yeah,
now your formal ID around accessing, online platforms and all that type of thing, right? Is interesting. I know we're taking a bit more of a deep dive into this aspect of, digital ID in a government sense and whatnot, but you think about what's happening really across the world in many different countries, where if a government, say for example, doesn't like the opinion you're putting out there, right? Let's
yeah,
just say,
yeah,
they listen back to like the first episode of last season where we talked about government and tech companies, and somebody didn't like what we were saying, and
yeah,
now they've gone in and they've revoked that digital ID to be used with YouTube or with a podcasting platform, and now you're able to like silence people if that's the ID you're using to access these services. Now we haven't gotten there quite yet, but who's to say we won't, right? When we're entering this new kind of paradigm shift of like not being able to know what's real, who's real, when it comes to AI and deepfakes and identities and everything else, I feel like you're going to see a bit more of a lean into a lot of these platforms saying, well, in order for you to participate in this platform, you need to prove that you are who you are, right? And that you're not misrepresenting or what have you, right? And I mean, there's some. If you look at, for example, LinkedIn, I've never tried to go create a fake profile, but by and large, I mean, you're interacting with people that have some semblance of real profiles, and people are using it to look for work. So it's one of the few social platforms where you kind of feel like you're interacting with real people instead of other platforms where you could be dealing with, Super Chicken 69. You don't know,
yeah.
who
Who
that
the hell
is
is
and
Super Chicken?
who's behind it, right? I
Super
don't
Chicken.
know on the Super Chicken, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's a cartoon from
These rubber
childhood, I
chickens,
think.
buddy. You better watch out for
Yeah,
them.
so I mean, but it,
Yeah,
it really calls into play a lot of different things. But I think maybe we can kind of segue that into like, we're talking about really like we started out by talking about, really your digital ID and accessing, government services and banking and all these other things. And that's definitely an important foundational piece of like having a digital identity because that's access to many of the things that are important in your life, right? And that allow you to pay your bills or be a good citizen or what have you, right? But then there's this idea of like your identity extends beyond like your social insurance number or what have you, right? Like it extends into like your likeness, your your representation in the media or as an actor or what have you, right? So like
your
I'm just
copyright of your work, right?
yeah, either
Yeah,
way, whether you're a famous person or not, I think it's like thinking about like your own likeness in
hmm
all these increasingly, visual platforms and, how is that protected and how can that be sort of, I guess, misused or I think it's interesting to kind of like think about this in terms of that because while like there's a technical legal government definition of ID, there's also like your likeness and how that's being used. I think is kind of interesting.
yeah. That is an interesting situation because when you think about actors, any type of very media-oriented personalities, their appearance, their looks. I mean, that's a large part of their identity.
Hmm.
That's their identification factor. You know, versus the average person that's working behind the scenes, they don't that appearance doesn't play as big a role, right? But big personalities, especially actors, um, their image now uh, is all over, you know, the internet.
What's the
And
value to that,
now,
right?
yeah, what's to keep, somebody generating an AI likeness of, John Wayne and, you know, uh, having them, sell, I don't know, radioactive isotopes. I don't know, but you can get into
Yeah.
that whole question, right? Of likeness and uniqueness, and where does it get to the point where, well, you're never, this might be a slightly, it might be a doppelganger of sorts. The image may be of a certain likeness, but it's not exactly you, right? So
Well, there's
therefore, it's
that, yeah.
okay to
Well,
use.
but you think about the value though. Like even if I mean, we're saying kind of likeness as far as a visual thing, but think about the value of identity and that someone who's, an actor or a musician or what have you, and that they've essentially amassed their fortune, or in some cases, they're really just making a living, but they're doing it based off of their likeness, but also, their reputation plays a lot into that, how they're perceived in the media. We've kind of lived through that era of, if you want to call it cancel culture or what have you, right? Sometimes that was happening kind of legitimately, when people were doing really horrible things, and other times it was just more of like a litmus test of what was going on in society in terms of morals and values and so on. And that really, in this age of being able to sort of manipulate that in a way, right? Whether it's deep fakes or what have you, right? It's, you could really cause damage to a person and their reputation, and
Yeah.
ultimately, kind of go down the rabbit hole of like really taking their career down. And I think that
So there is
that's a
that
danger.
damage for that individual. But think of um, misuse from the case of a person of authority, or somebody that has an effect over other people. Um, you know, the 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 prime minister or the president or whatever, an image being made of that leader saying something, right, to
Or
sway
portraying
public
something.
opinion or whatever. But it's all lies, right? It's all disinformation. It's all fake, right?
Yeah, how about like the former Prime Minister of Canada dating a pop star? Justin Trudeau dating Katy Perry, apparently. Is that real, or is that like an AI fake? I mean, we're getting to the point
Well, that's
where
right.
you probably
Anything you
could
see
do an
on
AI fake, right?
Yeah, anything you see on social media right now, I look at it and I say, is it 80% AI bullshit, or is it 20% possible, right? I really look at things as noise now. There's I can't I can't trust the source anymore, right? And this is where
Well,
we're
that is
getting
a
to.
problem.
You
Yeah.
can't trust the source.
Well, that's a big problem for sure, just in general. But think about even beyond like your own personal interpretation of that, right? And maybe you're a little bit more savvy than others, but even a video that looks very convincing, and we saw this through even like recent election cycles, where it can be, where it can spread, and that people don't have long attention spans, and that they're not overly critical about where it's coming from. Now you have this somebody that can use, someone's digital identity in the form of like a video, like a deep fake, to spread misinformation. And we all know, people live in these sort of media bubbles or political bubbles or what have you. And now something spreads like wildfire. That's not true. But now because people can see it with their eyes, they think it's true. So I think like we're living in
Yeah,
this age of like, there's not a lot of discernation around what people are looking at. And then the other thing that part of this is interesting, we've talked about this in other podcasts too, but think about then the bias that like you see this, it may not be true, but it reinforces maybe your dislike for that person or your dislike for that political party or whatever it is. And because it reinforces it, you want to believe it's true. Well, then that really lowers the threshold for you spending any time figuring out that is not true. And then you share that with somebody else that has the same predisposition that you have and is caught in the same media bubble. Now you have something that's ostensibly fake, that's completely spread like wildfire, and you're whoever's kind of manipulating that is really shaping a narrative, a false narrative that seems like these days some people don't really care whether it's true or not. They just only care that it reinforces their
yep.
existing belief or bias, right?
What's the fascination with posting on X or Facebook that a certain famous person has died, and it's a lie? What? And then
Yeah.
this goes across like wildfire. Everybody says, "Oh, that person died. That person. Sorry, I'm alive.
I'm
I'm
alive.
fine.
Hello. But
Hello."
are you alive, or is it a deep fake of you being alive? Right? I mean, this is
Yeah,
where we enter this like twilight zone of like up is down, and so on, right? Oh, when you think about celebrity as well, and like this idea of like bringing back likeness and so on, right? There was the article where, um, it was the daughter of Robin Williams, that was saying
yeah,
like people are sending her like tons and tons of videos of like AI generated versions of her father, right?
yeah,
Because either because they're just, they think it's something that she would like, or maybe they're being sadistic. Who knows what the reason is for, right? But it's not that person. And I think that's in and of itself
It's
that's an
offensive.
interesting
Yeah.
phenomenon, because now, I mean, this comes back, I guess I wanted to tie it back into this idea of like digital identity and ownership of your likeness. That, obviously when Robin was alive, we didn't have the legal framework. Well, we still don't, I guess, right? But now what happens to his identity, and can his estate claim, rights over the identity and force some of these, AI video platforms to not allow people to use that, right? If you looked at like the early days of AI, these platforms wouldn't allow you to create even an image that resembled a real person. And now you have these platforms, and you've seen this with Sora and OpenAI recently. You see it with Grok and the video generation attached to that, where you have certain producers saying, "No, just go create like whatever you want," right? And
Yeah.
I think like that's a real slippery slope, and I think that
Well, the contrary argument says, well, anything else is, well, it's censorship, right?
yeah.
And you turn around and you think, okay, what is censorship, right? And that word is wrong, right? If you think about it, it's upholding, individual rights and individual access to their own legitimate authentication of themselves, right? So, the argument is poor as far as I'm concerned to say, well, that's just censorship.
Well, that's the thing, because I mean, is your likeness just public domain then, right? And like back to like, do you have ownership of your own identity,
Yeah.
your own
Well, that's
likeness,
the way
your
it is
own
now.
like legacy, right? Where you don't have that, and I think it's interesting because where does that happen for? Are we gonna? I saw something the other day about somebody trying to recreate some unfinished like Alfred Hitchcock film, and is that
Right.
really a representation of his work? And what's his legacy? And back to the Robin Williams daughter, her name's Zelda, and I thought her comment was quite you know quite on point as far as and poignant in a way, right? Because she said to watch the legacies of real people be condensed down to this like vaguely looks and sounds like them, so that's enough. Just
Yeah.
so other people can churn out, what she called horrible TikTok slop, puppeteering them as maddening, right?
Yeah.
She said, "You're not making art. You're making disgusting, over-processed hot dogs out of the lives of human beings, out of the history of art and music, and then shoving them down someone else's throat, hoping they'll give you a little thumbs up and like
Little
it."
like, look for that like.
So I
Please
think
click
she
the
really
like
did
button.
like the knockdown on that, right? And it ties into all of this, right? So whether you're an average person or an actor, like like once people get a hold of that identity, what are they going to do with that? And then how is that going to be manipulated? And how many people are like unwittingly going to do that, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of
How
like
many bad actors are
the
there out there? Many, right?
well, you think about how much we give up of our, our likeness in terms of like social media platforms and so on. How many people are like posting photos and videos and, just on a personal level, but on a content creator level as well, right? And then what's the possibility there now that we in this new age of AI? If you look at, I mentioned that Sora app again. So one of the features in there is you can go through this process to essentially like digitally scan yourself into the app, where it creates this like 3D model of you, and then you can go and be creative with that model of yourself and do whatever you want. And that has some interesting possibilities if you want to go and be a creative person. But you can also give that up to other people. You can say, oh hey, I just want to let the platform use this. And how long before somebody uses it in a way that now you've lost your job, right? I mean, that's really
Well,
like the slippery slope that you can go down of like once you start to give away your digital identity into the, I guess, public domain or what have you, then you're sort of losing control, but you're giving permission for that, and that
yeah.
has wide-reaching implications, right?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of having that virtual avatar, right? Of that's your virtual uh, person, your personification of you in the virtual world. Um, you know, being able to access that and steal that and copy that, right? Here the problem is, if you think about it through history, being able to generate copies of you and information around you has been historically more difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now it's getting easier and easier, right? So it's gotten to the point where our systems, however, the different services and stuff, however good or poor they are from a security perspective, really define whether or not your security is intact, whether you'll have your identity copied or stolen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty, we're in a tenuous position right now, because of this digital world and all the physical attributes that are controlled by what's in the digital world, right? And being able to access that information we already talked about metadata more than a few times in the show, the idea of conglomerating data. But in order to get metadata, you take detailed data of individuals and you then turn it into metadata. And that metadata is supposed to represent everybody, so to speak, in a certain age group or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
conglomeration method is, right? But the idea is that you had the detailed information in the begin with, right? So who's maintaining that information? Who's controlling it? And, it goes back to not only where is it stored actively, where is it stored in a archived method or an archived process as well. So, where are the backups of the backups? And are those backups inherently secure or not? Right?
Or are they
And
accurate?
you think about it, that's where we get into, somebody will stumble upon, a method to, steal so many millions and millions and millions of, specific authentication and recognition IDs. And those IDs will not necessarily be put out on the web until maybe 4 years from now, so to speak. And in that meantime, they'll be able to do an incredible amount of damage, right?
Well, that's the thing. And then how do you control that, right? And you think
Yeah.
about we're in this sort of global internet fueled world, right? Where even if you have a digital ID and some laws within, Canada or the US or wherever you are about how that's going to be protected, but now somehow this has ended up, in the public sphere, whether you've, allowed it yourself through a social platform or what have you. Now, you could have, as you like to call them, bad actors in almost any country in the world. And we know that it's not always easy to go after somebody in a different country that has different laws and the way things are,
Yeah.
dictated. And increasingly, these social networks are existing in different geographic locations. I mean, it's really like once the genie's out of the bottle, it's going to be hard to like put it back in and you won't have as much control. So I guess the point I'm making is that you really have to think about how much of that you're putting out into the public realm and then what the potential implications are in terms of how that could be taken advantage of. But then again, if you're an entertainer, if you're a content creator, if you're what have you, it's inevitable that you have to put your identity out there on the internet. So like
Yeah.
what can you really do to protect that? And most importantly, not just identity theft, but how do you protect, deep fakes and manipulation and people, you see this all the time where there's like, duplicate fake social media accounts for singer-songwriters and actors where they've changed one letter in the last name and now they're out there putting out content as if they were that person and then trying to monetize it, and then even worse, pretending like they're that person and then pilfering money from people, right? There was
Yeah.
the one case where the lady got duped by someone pretending they were Keanu Reeves, and she sent them like tens of thousands of dollars, and all they did was clone his voice and started calling her and
Oh my, I haven't heard that one.
convincing her that it was Keanu Reeves and that he was in some other country shooting a movie and he was in trouble and he needed money. And apparently he could only pay for that using Bitcoin. That was what was going to get him out of legal trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about whether this person should have fallen for that, but
Right.
but at the same time, I mean, they were using pretty convincing things, and they were using video and audio and everything that they had basically cloned from Keanu Reeves to essentially like dupe this poor lady out of her life savings. I mean, this is
Yeah.
happening every day out there, right? And so it's so much more sophisticated. So like, how do you protect that? I don't have the exact answer, but I think we need to start thinking about it, right?
Yeah. I think, you brought up a few points. Like, for instance, you think about you sign up, financial institution, and you say, well, here's 4 or 5 questions that you need to provide answers to in the case that you need a backup account in order if you lose your credentials or what have you, right? Or if it goes into the next level of authentication. So, who's your first pet? Where'd you go to school at, right?
Yeah,
What's your mother's maiden name? These are common, questions, and then you look to the social account and you find the answers, right? You
exactly. You
go to
can't really use
Facebook or
that
whatever.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, why did you post that on Facebook, right? Don't put that information on Facebook. It's that simple. Don't. Don't do it, right?
But it's
And
hard, right? Like, how much are people going to police their lives, and especially younger generations that have just grown up and they live their entire life on digital platforms, and they're not going to think about that in that sense, right? Like,
well,
it
they'll be
is the
thinking
thing that you
about it
should
when their
do, but
identity is stolen and their bank account is empty. They'll be thinking
yeah.
about it then.
Oh, there's
Or
that.
their life
Yeah.
savings, they have, $100,000 in the bank to put it, buy their first house, and it's gone, right?
Well,
And
exactly. Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't take action until the bad things happen, right? And
yeah,
even I could be called guilty of not of being somewhat complacent in that regard, but I certainly have had a couple instances of credit cards getting stolen or what have you, and to make me think twice about the way that at least protect some of the basics in my life and make sure that I've got the right, as many authentication methods as I can have in hand. And, fortunately for me and you, we haven't lived our entire lives online,
yeah,
but there's enough of me out there, I guess, that somebody could use it, but I'm not high profile enough to be much of a target, I suppose. I mean, that's what I have going for me. I'm not Rob Williams or Harrison Ford, type thing. But
yeah. Well,
I
the
take you
idea is
on.
if you go after a target, it has to be worth your time, yeah, right? And but I would say that a lot of these specific hacker methods. I mean, they're just it's brute force against everybody because they can, right? And
At
whoever
scale.
whoever they
Yeah.
fish in, they fish them in, right? It doesn't really matter. So, I mean, if you're not a critical thinker, you can get caught, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So maybe like when you think about it, we could go further down the path of the bad actors and so on out there. But oftentimes, we like to use the analogy of like the frog boiling in water. Sometimes things just kind of happen slowly over time, as it were, right? That you don't, it's not an attack per se, but it's this like slow boiling in the water, and then all of a sudden you kind of realize you're being cooked, for example. And one of the areas I think is interesting, and I guess we kind of covered this. If someone wants to go back and listen, I forget which episode it was, but we did an episode. I think it ended off last season or the season before, perhaps, where we talked about being able to make a copy of yourself in the digital realm, and that you could sort of live forever, right?
Yeah,
We had the joke about we could then make copies of ourselves, and this podcast would go on into infinity. For example,
yeah,
until the last computer kind of fizzled out that was hosting the podcast, right? And somewhere 100,000 years in the future, or what have you. But you think about we're using these LLMs every day, right? We're using these platforms. And one of the things that I've learned is that if you use an LLM and you have an account, every time you log in, it knows who you are, right? It's kept some sort of log of like everything you've asked it. In fact, I saw an article about one guy saying that he told so much to an AI model that he started to almost use it as a therapist where he could ask him questions.
oh
And
my,
he was surprised at not just like how much information he must have given this LLM, but like how much then it could transfer that into like creating a profile of him. And the whole point of it is to try to like personalize it. So like the more you use this and the more it knows you. And you're seeing this with like digital assistants, and now you're going to get into like agentic AI, and who are sort of like digital coworkers and so on, right? Where they're going to learn more about you. And then there's this, company, Viven, they're called. They're developing like a specialized LLM for each employee in your company that effectively creates a digital twin of you as sort of an employee, right? It accesses all of your internal communications, electronic communications, documents, messaging, Google Docs, what have you. And then it builds up this like kind of digital twin. And it's interesting in one sense from like a productivity point of view, in that the example I saw somewhere was that, okay, you get an email from somebody and they're asking you to respond, and you could sit down and spend, 15, 20 minutes going through all your documents and everything and trying to figure out how to respond to this person and what information to provide them. Or this LLM can just go through all your background and formulate a response based on everything you've ever written and done and communicated in the company. And then they formulate this email, and then you can like add a little personal thing at the end and send it off. So it's interesting in concept that it could really speed up productivity, because there's times I've had to respond to something, go on a goose chase looking for information and what have you. But think about the concept of it creating a digital twin of you, and then how, I know this is your favorite subject, Patrick, how long before this digital twin is as competent or more competent than you are, and the company's
Yeah.
like, well, we'll just keep the digital twin
Yeah.
because
Fire your
he,
butt.
he doesn't need a vacation, and he doesn't need a sick day, and he's
Yeah.
faster, and so on, right? So it's, when does productivity tip over into like this digital twin taking over your work life? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
So you got Agent Jason. He's going to take over your job.
yeah,
That'll happen. Well,
just
what would
the
Agent
Matrix.
Jason say? I don't want to know what Jason would say.
No, say, Mr. Lazan, you seem to be living two different lives.
That's right. Yeah, and we don't need any squishy humans anymore. Get
That
them out
was
of the way.
Agent Smith in the Matrix, right? Where they just made like 8,000 copies of him that exist in the Matrix and go
That's
after
right. Right.
rogue agents or what have you, right? But it's, I mean, that's quickly the realm we're kind of segueing into, right? And so we talked about this in terms of like social media and celebrities, but now you're seeing this sort of like idea of digital twin and what have you entering the workplace. I mean, we've talked about agentic AI being sort of this virtual employee, as it were, right? That can come in and replace a computer programmer or what have you, right? Or some other role in the company. But this is a whole different idea of like now the
Right.
model creating a digital twin of you.
Well, they're compelling
And
people to actually, cooperate and provide input about who they are and how they would respond to things, and actually feed these models. And they're doing it's not coercive. They're basically doing it in a you know they're looking at volunteerism going on here. That, oh yeah, and then what's the end result, right? Like you
yeah,
said, what is the end result? The end result is now you got this not so secure LLM that has way too much data on you and who you are, right? And I don't know who this individual was that pumped in all their information so they could have you know a therapy performed on them. That's kind of a scary thing. But those those are not secure platforms yet, right? They like to say they're secure, but they're not. AI platforms are inherently insecure right now. Um,
but we still use them
Therefore,
every day, right? It's like
yeah,
the frog boiling in water that we're using. It's convenient. It's a productivity tool, and granted, that's fantastic as well. But it is continuing to learn everything about what's going on in your company, about you, about your work, about your portfolio. And think about it the other way as well, is that these large language models have also been trained on huge data sets of learning. So this LLM already knows everything there is to know about marketing, everything there is to know about, product development or computer programming or it's already got a leg up. It's like Neo in the Matrix, where he just plugged in and learned kung fu in like 3 seconds, right?
Yeah.
We see that, right? We see where these models have been pre-trained, like the models have been pre-trained on this huge data set, and you can basically ask it to act as kind of like any expert, and it automatically has this base of knowledge. So that's like the knowledge base. Now we give it context, which is your work environment and your company and your customers and your go-to-market plans or whatever the heck it is. Now you've given it context. We've also given it access to the tools now because it has access to email, to chat, to Google Docs, to everything else. I mean, what's left at that point? I mean, that's really you in a nutshell from a digital identity at work, that you have a knowledge base of education, you have the context of the company you work in, you have the tools to execute the job. Other than maybe emotional intelligence, I don't know what I'm missing here, right?
You're talking yourself out of a job already. Yeah. So
I think so,
it's
man, but
interesting
it's,
where that's going. Yeah. And I'm
yeah.
not going to go and volunteer that, right? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be that naive. I'm going to ask the question, why? Why do you need that to know that, right? Not volunteer it. Yeah, and, be that as may, if you talk, other generations, or that they want to be more freer with their information, that's fine and dandy. But they don't have to. We're talking about individuals here, not generations. You know, if you want to give that information up, there's a cost, right? And to me, anyway, I look at the idea of immediate feedback and versus long-term feedback too, right? What are the long-term costs for an immediate gain? I I like to think that way. It's called critical thinking. Not
Yeah.
to say I get it all the time. Not to say I get it right.
Well, yeah, that's what they call the opportunity cost, I think, right? Or
Yeah,
something of that nature,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, the
Like
opportunity cost.
you have the opportunity to gain something, but what is really like the cost of that, and what does that mean ultimately, right? I think
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
key part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're dealing with now is people aren't being educated on the long-term cost, long-term implications of what they do in the virtual digital realm, right? And
Well, yeah,
it's a matter
absolutely.
of education.
Well, when you think about it, I mean, back to this idea of like a digital twin, for example, you know, this latest news story that Hollywood's up in arms about, right? This Tilly Norwood, which is this new virtual
Yeah,
actress that started out as, I guess, an experiment, and now they're treating her like a real actress, and they're actually shopping her around to some of the talent, the agencies that represent talent, and of course there's huge backlash in Hollywood. And there was a comment from I forget who it was who said that anyway, but one of the major actresses there said, well, they're saying that Tilly could be the next Scarlett Johansson. And she's like, well, we already have Scarlett Johansson. But I mean, you think about this ability of AI to really like mimic and learn, and they can create virtual versions that are very close to that. And that's sort of another area where when you think about that digital likeness, now you have it impacting like real livelihoods in some cases. Now, obviously, some of these actors are really highly paid, but in some cases, they're you just have a standard, or you just have like an actress or an actor that's trying to break into the business, and they're using their likeness to do that. And now you have this ability to create a clone that works fairly close to what that person
deep fake. Yeah,
is, right? That in essence kind of like a deep fake, I suppose, but we're kind of entering like a bit of a new realm when it even comes to that. And back to like what is the protection of digital identity, and this sort of fake actress, or however you want to position that, right? Tilly Norwood, I mean, she's based off of some conglomeration of real people, of studying like human behavior and so on, into some sort of entity that's probably fairly close to somebody that's already out there. It just hasn't like come forward yet, right? And like what does that mean for the
well, the
future of
reality
entertainment,
the
right?
reality is if you get taken advantage of because you're a bit naive or you weren't on the money watching things, and you get taken advantage of from a digital perspective, and you lose, your assets, you're out, right?
Yeah.
If you try to, if there's some damage to your reputation or what have you, you go through the legal machine. The legal machine is you know, grinds like a, you know, old beast. It's so far back in the queue for you that maybe 10 years you'll get some kind of monetization back to support all your costs. It
Hmm.
the system to support it, the laws have not caught up to it. The delivery systems of the law are not up to it. It's everything's broken from that perspective. So protection isn't there, right? It's the
Yeah.
damage can be done and with little to no protection, right? And you know, are you prepared for that, right?
That's always the case, right? Governments are always slower than the advancement of tech, right? You think about any of the laws around social media platforms or any sort of emerging tech, and the government's always so many years behind because
Yeah,
the tech kind of explodes out of nowhere like AI has. The governments start looking at it, they debate it, they have to come up with a law, and then by the time they even get that law passed, things have moved even
it's
faster. I mean,
already out of
you're
date.
seeing this with AI right now, right? And then
Yeah,
who's to say that this likeness is maybe it looks a little bit like Scarlet, but it's different enough that it's
yeah,
fair
it's different
use, and
enough.
but then could actors license their digital self? I think this technology is going to get to the point ultimately if they keep driving down this path where you're not going to know the difference. That you're going to be watching a movie and you think you're watching Scarlett Johansson and it's not, right?
Yeah,
And
personally, I wanna know when I'm watching AI. So if it's an
but
artificial,
will
if
you
it's a
know?
non-truth, I want to know, right?
And will you be discerning enough to kind of figure that out? But most importantly, are there people that are going to care? I mean, you care, but will we get to a point where that's just maybe not a valuable thing because people have been inundated with so much that's fake, right? It was, kind of brings me to this quote here from I wanted to bring up. This was like the head of Instagram, right? And of course, he was kind of saying that AI is really given to people for anybody to be creative. And I think that's true, right? If you have the ability to create digital actors, you can
Yeah,
tell stories and create movies out of your own imagination. You don't need $1 million Hollywood contract. You don't need what have you. So it opens up, the creative part. But I mean, it was, um, I thought what was interesting about his quote, and I think you'll like this one, right? He was kind of saying that, well, maybe it's not fully the platform's responsibility to label AI content. So, in other words, maybe Instagram doesn't have to label video as AI video, which I mean, I think that's a bit of a slippery slope. But he's saying, well, society will have a change, right? He said, well, my kids are young. I need them to understand as they grow up. Just because they're seeing a video of something doesn't mean it actually happened. You know,
that's
he
so
said,
much BS to
yeah.
that. I'm sorry.
He said,
Like,
when I grew up, I saw a video, I could assume that it was a capture of a moment that happened, but now they
yeah,
can't. And this is the interesting part. He said they're going to have to think about who's saying it, who's sharing it, what are their incentives, why they might be saying it. I mean, really, I mean, is
that's
a
BS.
9-year-old going to go through that to figure that
No,
out? Right?
no, that is just total. That's naive bullshit. I'm sorry. To think that's going to be okay. That's not okay, right? And all these platform guys, they can stand on their little stools and preach to the populace about how good it is, but it's not, right? It's the wrong way to go. If something's not the truth, then it should be labeled as artificial.
Well, that's the direction things are going in, though, right? That you see this across platforms where they're kind of they're either absolving themselves of responsibility. Remember back when we talked about AI and copyright, right? Sam Altman saying that, well, if the model created something that looks like Charlie Brown, then that's not really our fault. I mean, that's what the model did. I'm like, you guys created, you guys created the model, right? So it's like, then you have like this idea now that they're saying, well, we're just going to like crowdsource this in a sense, or we're going to have like community guidelines that it's up to the community to report whether they feel something is fake. Oh, because the community now is going to like self-organize and make sure that
Yeah,
everything's
that's not going
reported
to happen.
appropriately, right? Again, people aren't going to take the time. We live in busy lives. We have short attention spans. So like none of that's going to work as well. And so like you're going to find that it's going to contribute a bit to like the disintegration of like motivation to participate in creative arts to some extent. Although I don't think it'll ever fully go away because people have like a passion about some of this stuff, right? But I even saw an example of like, there's a lot of kerfuffle around these what they call these AI generated bands. If you want to go back and listen to our last season, we used the platform Suno to create all of these like theme songs for each episode, and
Yeah.
some of them were pretty convincingly good.
Yeah.
That if you had
Yeah.
played it in a playlist alongside some of the artists I like, I might go, "Oh, who's that new band? That sounds pretty good." Like on
That
first
sounds good.
listen,
Yeah.
and then little aspects of it start to jump out at you. But if you're not discerning, if it's background music, it's in the car, it's at a party, who knows? But you had this example of like an AI generated band, which this guy created and called Bleeding Verse. And basically used a real band as its influence. This band was called Holding Absence, apparently. Um,
Okay,
and
great name.
it eclipsed monthly Spotify listeners within 2 months. Within 2 months, the AI generated band was getting more listeners than the actual real band that had spent probably years honing their craft, writing music, creating albums. This guy comes along, feeds it to Suno or whatever he used to create it,
In a few
puts it on
minutes.
Spotify, and now this fake AI band is making more money than the actual band it was influenced
Yeah.
off of, right? And then back to like the platform, Spotify is not really doing anything to fix this. Why? Because they're seeing more engagement on the platform. They don't care whether you're listening to an AI band or a real band because you're listening on the platform, which in the free version is ad revenue and the paid version means you're paying for it. Here's the kicker for artists on Spotify, though, which I thought was kind of interesting, is that the monetization model is that Spotify, I don't know, I'm just going to use a simple number, right? Spotify makes $10 million dollars in a month. And based on how many songs got streamed that month, then they divide up some percentage of that pie and they give it to all the artists. But now you've got people that aren't artists that are using AI platforms that are getting a piece of that pie. And now the piece of the pie is getting smaller for the real artists because now the pool of people and they're putting music on the platform is expanded hugely, but that's largely due to AI. So now you've got now this idea of, AI generated music really infecting and bringing all this slop into a platform and it's getting embedded in playlists and people are listening to it. But the point of digital identity is that does the band Holy Absence have any right to their digital identity, to the music they created, and that an AI couldn't be trained on it, and then you put that on Spotify, and
Well,
somehow the
somebody's making
algorithm
money
picks it
off
up,
it.
right? Well,
Whoever's
exactly,
doing the
right?
creation of this, that person is behind that, and that person's the one making the money, right? So in the end, if you're creating an AI persona, and you're also part of that. You're the creator of that AI persona, and that should be identified, right? And bottom line is, if that AI persona does something or says something or alludes to something, and there's some kind of legal situation around that, the person who created that persona is the one who's responsible.
Well, essentially, right? They've taken the action to do it, and
Yeah,
they've gone out and done it, but there's no real sort of legal protection, I guess. I mean, this band could go after this person and what have you, but then not a lot of artists have won that case, right? And that something's close enough but not quite exact, and then what kind of legal standing do they have to kind of go after, right? So
yeah,
it's really created this like wild west of like really like identity is up for grabs, right? Whether you want to
yeah,
create a fake video or a fake music artist or what have you. We're really entering kind of an interesting realm of possibility, both on the really interesting, cool side, but also on the really kind of scary side
yeah. I mean,
for maybe all
if
of us,
these
right?
tech leaders, don't have the character and the balls enough to make a stand for what's right out there, and want to run into the corners every time there's something challenging to deal with on their technology. In the end, what's going to happen is people will just abandon. Like if you go to any kind of social media platform and it just all lies, you log out and you never go back, right? Because it's just noise, right? And this is what you're going to see. You're going to see a wholesale abandonment of these technologies because they're saying it's just lies. It's just junk. You're kind of seeing that now. A lot of people are switching from 10 to 11 on Windows, being forced to go over, and then Windows is now integrating AI right on their desktops, and it's funneling all this data back to Microsoft,
Hmm.
Microsoft databanks, and the idea is, okay, well, I don't want my data being funneled back there. right? I don't want that. And a lot of these people are saying, enough's enough, right? I'm not part of this, contributing machine, giving up all my information, all my identity to Microsoft. I'm going to move to Linux, right?
Well,
And
yeah,
you're seeing that
ultimately,
today. People are making the choice to say, if your platform is a sieve and not protecting my rights, you're not protecting my interests, then I don't need you, right?
hmm
And I feel that that's what's going to happen in the future. Now, I'm always wrong on things, so I could be wrong here. Um, the I'm not. I shouldn't say always wrong. I'm sometimes wrong. Um,
we're all wrong sometimes,
I'm
right? I
wrong
mean,
sometimes, and sometimes I'm
look,
not.
Patrick. I mean, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So, like, come
There
on,
you
let's give
go.
you some credit, right?
Yeah, I'm right twice a day. So, the idea is, where are we going in the future, right? I think that's a big question. When people are seeing AI slop all over the place, what are they really going to trust, right?
hmm
Who are they going to go to then when it's just noise,
Well, I think it's an interesting comment, right? Because we covered that a little bit if someone wants to go back and listen to our sloppening episode. But you
Yeah,
are seeing a lot of, slop online, a lot of AI generated content. In fact, you now have like platforms being created. Meta just launched a platform. I forget the name off the top of my head. That the whole thing is AI videos, and that's the same with Sora, right? So, at least in that instance, when you go on there, you know that everything you're looking at is AI, and then it becomes this like sort of a slow moving train wreck that you just want to go in and look at, or you find it interesting. You want to kind of get an idea of what you can create. I think that's an interesting concept in and of itself. That at least when you go into the platform, you know it's AI. It's when it infiltrates in and mixes in with everything that's not real. But I think the market, does decide sometimes, or maybe the market's the wrong word, but like society, and you've seen these huge shifts to different platforms, in different ways, especially in this age of like, once the internet got into like social media platforms, initially it was MySpace, right? And then MySpace just mishandled however they were, you know, using that platform to connect people. And then people just left, right? And never regained, right? And then people end up on Facebook. And then you've seen some degree of that on X, right? Where it used to be some sort of, sort of balanced platform in terms of how you were interacted there, and now it's really leaned in a different way. People can debate whether before it was too much to one side or another, but you've definitely seen like kind of a mass exodus from that platform based on a lot of the parameters around how that's run and guidelines and what have you, right? So I think the
yeah,
one thing I think you're going to see though, and this is where I think we're kind of in this we're in this real we're deep in the sloppening now, if you want to put it that way, right? And
yeah,
there's so much of it, but I find that like eventually people just kind of get sick of it, and then they crave things that are more authentic and genuine. And I heard somebody talk about this recently, so I'm kind of borrowing this a little bit, but I've been thinking the same thing myself, right? Where and you're starting to see this like proliferation of AI generated content online and in the workplace, and it's starting to take on a bit of like a generic quality, if you will, right?
hmm
And I think people genuinely seek out like authenticity and real creativity. And so I think like you can kind of go in one way and people will say like, well, this is just taking over. And we spent a lot of this episode talking about it, right? Where it's going to take over music and it's going to take over movies and it's going to, really proliferate. But I do think there's going to be enough of like a sameness or a generic quality or a fakeness or whatever it is that people are now going to really be able to spot things that are genuine and real, and that there's going to be like a value to that. I think you're going to see that emerge over time. It's kind of like any situation, any platform that gets inundated with a lot of crap, then people gravitate towards the stuff that's actually like really good. At least that's my hope for humanity. I don't know if that's where we're going to end up, Patrick, but what do you think? Where are we headed with all this? Are we because there's a lot of positivity here. There's a lot of
yeah.
like democratizing content creation and really interesting technology that could be used in really cool, interesting ways. But there's also like that really horrific downside to all of it, whether it's stealing the digital identity or it's slop or what have you. But where do you think we're going to net out on all this?
I do think we're going to see a centralized um, government managed identification platform
We're heading in that
where the
direction. Yeah.
systems that utilize that ID will be paying for that, right? And those ID systems will be biologically linked to their owners. I
Hmm.
do think that. I think that's an inevitability here. Um, but I also think that we're going to look at a next generation of security too. Well, as our computing power increases, we're going to get more and more complex encryption and more capability. Like we said, this blockchain approach and that kind of thing, where you can, resurrect a traceability to identify and verify a specific entity, right? So I think that will converge, right? Um, and I think there's going to be systems out there that are going to be able to defeat those systems, and they're always going to be playing, catch up against each other. So there's always going to be some loophole, and there's always going to be some, security change, but it'll be at the next level, right? Um, and that'll just be an unending game of catch up. I see that now, right? There's always going to be some, victims in this identification management that bad actors are going to do some damage. However, that being said, we talk about deepfakes and we talk about AI, generated noise, and we talk about, our little AI actor. I think there's going to be, that all will settle out in the wash. I think the law itself needs to be updated and updated fast. I think our governments are way too slow. They need to move faster to catch up with the times, to protect people, right? To protect their interests. In order to, and I also think our platform designers and our, tech leaders need to step up to the plate. And it's, their sheepish, approach of pushing everything back to, let society, make those decisions. It's just BS. They need to step it up. So
Yeah,
I do
absolutely.
think that in the end, we're going to be able to force those platforms to do that because we can vote. We can vote with our wallets. We can vote with our use of their systems, and we could say no, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's power in numbers, and then,
Yeah,
if you think about it, right? Like we live in this, massive world full of 7 billion other humans or whatever, right? And one of the only things that we have is our identity, right? And while we share similarities with like, a lot of different people, it's probably one of the things that we have the most pride in as a human, right? And our identity is made up of many different things, like we talked about, right? It's made up of our behaviors and our likeness and, however you want to frame it, right? But I do think identity is important to people. And even if you're not, a politician or a celebrity or, a singer songwriter, that your identity and the value in your identity is one of the only things that really makes you
yeah,
you, right? And it's the one thing that you really, when you think about it, you hold dear. And when people feel like that's like being ripped away from them, I think that's when you're going to see, sort of a bit of a rebellion, I guess, as it were, right? Like there's always, the pendulum will always shift back, but it's, when people realize that's being taken away from them, I think that's where, you're going to see some cracks and things emerge. If we want to bring it back to Dennis Quaid in Total Recall, he said, "If I'm not me, who the hell am I?"
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from